So, what is Muskeg? It is. It comes from the Cree and Ojibwe. From the Cree, Muskeg, and Ojibwe, Muskeg, meaning grassy bog. And I'm reading from the Canadian Encyclopedia here. It's a type of northern landscape characterized by wet environment, vegetation, peat deposits. Chiefly used in North America, the term muskeg escapes precise scientific definition. It encompasses various types of wetlands found in the boreal zone, including bogs, fens, swamps, and mires, whatever they are. Can everybody hear me? All right. So this book was a long time in the making. My old teacher, Peter Guy, would say that it's not a straight-up sequel to Hand Me Down My Walking Cane, which will also be sold here tonight, but rather sequel-ish in the sense that it uses some characters from the first novel, but largely showcases some of the secondary characters in that first novel. And I've always been enamored by the bog. I grew up in Lake Woods County, right on the border where you could see Canada across the river, and we kind of lived an odd existence up there. We were miles from everything, no television, no nothing. We got radio from Winnipeg. When we finally got a Canadian channel, or rather we got a channel of TV, it was from Winnipeg. So it was an odd growing up, to say the least. And adding to that was a setting. Lake of the Woods is largely Lake of the Woods, this humongous lake, and bog and forest, and some farms that have been carved out, I don't know how, from the forest and the peat bogs. And Muskeg, which is peat, it's the word for peat, has a very large presence in the area of folklore where I grew up. I mean, we called it Muskeg. I did not even know that it meant peat or what peat was. I'd read the word peat in books about Ireland, but I had no idea that peat and muskeg were one and the same. I think until I was a senior in high school, we had to explain to a teacher, a substitute teacher, what muskeg meant, and she explained to us what peat meant. So it's such a big deal in my hometown, which is Baudette, that the school paper is called Muskeg, which, by the way, I drew up 10 fun facts about Muskeg. I'll just let...
Okay, wait.
Well, you don't have to read it. Anyway, just because I'm so intrigued by it. And so is Erin, which is why I asked her to come and be with me tonight, and she very graciously agreed. So the basic theme of a bog is that you cannot tame it. And the Irish have tried, and Erin will talk to you about that. But up in Lake of the Woods, there were all these attempts made to make it into arable farmland. There was something called the Federal Ditching Act, which was intended in Lake of the Woods County to drain the bogs, which, if any of you know anything about bogs, know that it's impossible. And so that didn't go well. But people who settled in those areas were then taxed for the ditches, which didn't do them any good. And settlers also tried to burn it, and that was also really stupid because it is, after all, flammable material, albeit not like kerosene. And so the fires just kind of sunk down into the land and kept burning. And people then and now still disappear, and we never see them again. And I'm sure that if Minnesota, God forbid, were mining their peat, we would have bodies coming up in the peat bogs too. Thank God they haven't done that. And up in Lake of the Woods, we believe in bog witches. We believe that there are these kind of flickering little entities, and that if they like you, the person who gets lost in the bog, then they'll lead you out. If they don't like you, you're kind of on your own. So I'm going to read you a couple very short selections from my new book, Muskeg. And by the way, it's great cover design. Little bog witches are flitting from tree to tree there, so that's what that is. I have a character in this book called Little Roy. He is a fiddler, and he's selectively mute. He's traumatized by a fire that burned up his family, a fire that happened, in fact, in 1910 in Lake of the Woods County. Muskeg was an Indian word Little Roy's pa told him when he was a boy. He remembered that the teacher from Minneapolis didn't know what it meant, and the kids had to explain it to her. How layers of plants built up in the bog and packed together until they were like soft coal. Then homesteaders tried to burn it off, thinking they'd get rid of weed trees and scrub, plow it up and get good black soil. But the fires burrowed down into the ground deeper and deeper, feeding on those layers, and that's where they stayed, smoldering away. In the winter, they sent up little curls of smoke through the snow. Little Roy learned not to step near them, so as not to fall in up to his waist or over his head. In spring and summer, the bog was wet but harder to read. You'd be walking along in little hills of sedge and think how nice it was if God could laid out a path for you. But if you slipped or missed a spot, your leg could go in all the way to your hip, and you'd be stuck in something between mud and quicksand. That's why people feared the bog more than forest or water. When folks disappeared, they usually weren't found. Sometimes Little Roy imagined all the lost people standing down there, preserved like bees and honey. Everyone said that if the bog witches liked you, they'd lead you out. Those who were lucky enough to find their way back swore they'd seen little dancing lights that guided their way. Little Roy hoped that they liked him. He talked to them and left them things. Blue flag irises in the spring, raspberries in the summer, bittersweet vines full of orange berries in the fall. In the winter, he stayed away. He guessed the bog witches had no love for people tramping around the surface of their home with boots and snowshoes, yelling and chopping down spruce or pine. That's Little Roy. One of the recurring characters from Hand Me Down My Walking Cane is Sadie, who's a former madam during the boom years until the Depression, as Sherelle. And this is a scene from her in the bog, and it's dark. She stumbled forward, unnerving not to be able to see where she was going. She became very aware of her feet and what was under them. Sometimes they crunched plants and twigs, her favorite bog terrain, solid, at least more solid than the rest of it. Then there'd be a hillock, then another, so she felt like she was walking on stepping stones. Little Roy would pause and make a splashing noise with his foot, which meant that her next steps would be slogging through muck and bog water. The splashes were fine. It was a sucking noise she dreaded, a sign the bog wanted to keep her. Muskeg smoke drifted low. Sadie liked how it smelled, bittersweet, like the name of her favorite fall plant. Thank you, and I will give up the floor to Erin.
Really short. I have no childhood or early connection to the bogs. In 1986, I read a book of poems by Seamus Heaney. One of the poems was Bogland, and there's a line in it that he says, butter sunk under more than 100 years was recovered salty and white. And I was really intrigued by that. And so I was visiting friends in Ireland a few weeks later and asked my friend's mother, did she ever hear of people finding butter in the bogs? She said, oh, they find loads of interesting things in the bogs. And what she didn't tell me was her son-in-law was the head of the archaeology department at UCD in Dublin. And he had found, a wooden road from 2,000 years ago, buried under the bog, wooden practice swords from the Middle Ages. Oh, yes, she said. And then there was a story of two brothers cutting turf who found the perfectly preserved severed head of a beautiful red-haired girl. And I'm like scribbling in my travel journal that night, thinking of writing a novel about a red-haired girl whose head is found in a bog, maybe a movie. And so I couldn't believe, I haunted bookshops in Ireland trying to find somebody who'd written a story set in the bog. There were none. The bog is like backwoods, podunk, nobody wants to be there kind of a place in Ireland. It was so fascinating to me because actually the word bog, I was going to tell you, is Irish. It means soft. Bogach is a soft place. And in Ireland there are two types of bogs. High bogs, which are like our bogs, lakes that have turned into sort of land masses floating on water. They're usually spring fed. And blanket bogs that are on the coastlines in the mountainy areas, moors we'd call them if they were in Scotland or England. And they're only about 5 or 6 feet deep, and they formed when the trees were cut down about 6,000 years ago. But in ancient Ireland, the bog was seen as an opening to the other world, a threshold, a place of transformation, a liminal space. It wasn't fully land, it wasn't fully water, and it was a place of sacrifice. So they have found all sorts of things in bogs, lots of gold, lots of butter, and they don't know if the butter was put in there because it was a cooler or because that was a really valuable commodity in ancient Ireland. Cattle were the currency of ancient Ireland, and butter was one of the things that came from cows. So I was just so intrigued by this red-haired girl and where she had come from, and why was it only her head, and where was the rest of her, and what could possibly have happened. I wrote to the archaeologist's brother-in-law who was involved in her discovery. He was a child at the time. His father was also an archaeologist and the head of the National Museum, another thing she neglected to mention to me. But I eventually got the full story of that she'd been there about 350 years. They had no idea where the rest of her was. And so I just started with that little kernel of truth and had to make up a story. I thought, she needs a story, even if I have to make it all up. So that was how Haunted Ground came about. So my characters are Cormac McGuire, who's an archaeologist, and Nora Gavin, who's an American, Irish-American pathologist and someone who's interested in bog people. And she's kind of based on the woman who helped me with my research. Her name was, can I even remember her name? Anyway, she had Nora's job. She was a teacher of anatomy at Trinity College in Dublin. And she was also an actress and a singer, and so Nora became a singer. I was thinking of making Nora a singer, and then I thought, nah, nobody will believe that. I already have all these other musicians, And she was also the granddaughter of Eamon de Valera, who was the first president of Ireland. So, really interesting person. So, I'm going to read you a little bit from the opening scenes of Haunted Ground. And it's when the red-haired girl has just been discovered by these two brothers who are cutting turf. And they have called the police, and then the police call the archaeologists because they realize it's somebody who hasn't been there much longer than their purview. So Cormac and Nora are there, and they're starting the excavation. And all of these details about how they're doing this excavation were given to me by Maura Delaney, that's her name, the doctor from Trinity College. "Are you ready?" Cormac asked. She nodded wordlessly, then climbed down into the cutaway beside him. "First, we have to determine the way the body is situated before we begin the complete excavation," Cormac said. "The head appears to be turned at roughly 45-degree angle to the cutaway floor here, which means the body could be articulated in any number of ways." He was aware that this was probably Nora's first experience of a bog body in situ. So after carefully covering the head once more with wet peat, Cormac pulled paper and pencil from his bag and hastily drew a sketch to show her what they were about to do. "So here's the head, right? The body could be fully extended or flexed, and it could also be angled downward if it's intact. We'll mark out as much of a circle as we can, then dig small test pits like this," he said, making small circles on the diagram. That's just what she did. "Starting from the outside of the circle and moving inward. That way we can establish how large a block of peat will have to be removed. The pits should be about 50 centimeters apart and 20 to 30 centimeters deep. We'll have to dig with our bare hands. That way we can't do any damage. And it's important for sensing the texture of the material." He unstrapped his wristwatch, glancing at it briefly before putting it into his pocket. "If only it weren't so late in the day. We'll have to work quickly." He handed her his waterproof jacket. "You can kneel on this if you like. Any last thoughts before we get stuck in?" "I don't think so," she said. Her eyes rested for an instant on his stubbly chin, and as she turned away, Cormac felt a faint flush of embarrassment. In the rush to get out here, he hadn't taken the time to shave. He lifted his sweater over his head and rolled up his sleeves. As he worked, plunging his bare arm into the dense waterlogged peat, he considered that there was nothing in the world quite like the consistency of turf. If a bog wasn't exactly liquid, it wasn't exactly solid either, but a curious mixture somewhere between the two. It was also extremely cold. With their sleeves and shirt fronts completely soaked through, both he and Nora had to stop every few minutes to warm their hands. After nearly 20 minutes, thoroughly probing almost the entire arc of their circle, they had turned up nothing at all. "Is it just me?" she asked, leaning back and rubbing off tiny flecks of wet peat that stuck to her arms. "Or is something missing here, like any sign of a body?" "Let's have another look at her," Cormac said. With Nora watching over his shoulder, he removed a larger portion of the protective peat to find the woman's features obscured by her long red hair, which clung like seaweed on a victim of drowning. Bog tannins gave hair of every hue, even black hair, a reddish tinge, but it was still possible to tell the original color. Cormac carefully lifted the damp strands and laid them aside, then froze when he saw what lay beneath. The girl's mouth was clamped tightly shut, her top teeth embedded in the flesh of her lower lip. One eye stared wildly, the other was half closed. Her face seemed distorted with fear, a far cry from the images he'd seen of Iron Age bogmen, whose unblemished bodies and tranquil expressions led to theories that they were either drugged or willing victims of sacrifice. In its brief exposure to the air, the girl's hair had already begun to dry, and a few strands began to play in the breeze that scooped down into the trench. Something about this tiny movement made it seem for one surreal instant that she was alive. Cormac felt Nora Gavin's involuntary start beside him. "Shall I go on?" he asked. Nora's head turned slowly until her eyes met his, and she nodded. Cormac continued scraping away the soft black turf with his fingers until what he half suspected was confirmed. The girl's neck ended abruptly, he estimated, between the third and fourth vertebrae. He sat back on his heels. "My God," said Nora, "she's been decapitated." The girl was young, perhaps no more than 20, and if you removed the ghastly expression, had probably been quite beautiful, with a gracefully arched brow, high cheekbones, and a delicate chin. Beside his knee, Cormac could make out the ragged fringe of rough fabric like torn burlap. Who was this girl that she had come to such a harsh and desolate end? When he rose again slowly to his feet, he found the McGanns and the young policeman gazing at her solemnly as he and Nora had done, in silence.
I was thinking that before our conversation, maybe we should take the table back,
Yeah, for sure.
because otherwise, no, it's okay. So I guess we can, do you want us to use this mic or use the one you got down the floor?
Take that one out. It's
Okay. So we'll just turn this one off. Ah, perfect. Got our own.
Hello.
Hi. So Erin and I are going to talk to each other about our work. I was, like I said, really honored that she said yes to be in conversation with me here, because she's a writer I've admired for a long time. And as I told her, and I tell everybody who will listen, I think that we're the only fiction writers, at least in Minnesota, and maybe the whole country, I don't know, who set our fiction in the bog, albeit hers are in Ireland, mine are in northern Minnesota. So it seemed perfect. Yeah. Strong woman characters, all kinds of other stuff.
Twins separated at birth.
That's right. So we've got some questions for each other. We're okay on time, aren't we? Think?
Yep.
Okay, all right. We have some questions for each other, and discussion questions. And what do you think? We'll go back and forth?
Yeah. Can I
Yeah.
ask you the first one?
Yeah,
All
you can
right.
do that. Okay, then we'll take questions from you.
And luckily, you read exactly that part I was thinking about when I was writing the question. Little Roy thinks about how bogs are made and the people who disappear into the bog witches, and all the gifts that he leaves for them. So I wondered what folklore about the bogs you grew up with, any kind of stories or things that people just knew about the bog.
Well, this is one of those times, and I really wish I were Ojibwe, and I'd probably know a whole lot more about the real ancient history, which I don't. But in among the people I grew up with, the main things were that muskeg smoke, which comes every fall when the bog dries out, and it can really obscure things. I mean, you can get like this kind of smog of muskeg smoke. I personally like the smell, but people think it's more, they always say that it's harder to get around in muskeg smoke than regular smoke, and you have to really be careful. And I don't know if that's about the muskeg smoke or if it's more about the bog itself, although the muskeg smoke will drift, so you can drive into Baudette or someplace, and even though it's miles away, you'll be smelling it. So there's that, but I think the main other two things are the bog witches, and I don't know if anybody really has a clear idea of what they're supposed to look like, but people really believe in them, and I'm kind of on that bridge where I remember when I was, I don't know, a young girl, very young girl, and I kind of knew there wasn't a Santa Claus, but I also really wanted to believe there was a Santa Claus. So that's kind of where I am with bog witches. Sometimes I believe in them and sometimes I don't. But
as they say in Ireland, sure, no one believes in them, but they're there.
But they're there, exactly. That's what I would say. No one believes in them, although
You
people...
sure as hell would believe it if you were lost in the bog.
That's exactly right. That's what I say. That and the mystery of people lost in the bog, or it's not folklore, it's just one of the things I grew up hearing. People who walked away, whether they were drunk or they were half crazed or they were careless or there was something. A lot of people go blueberry picking in the bog, and but if they're smart, they'll just stay in one little place and get in and get out. But people definitely get lost in the bog, and some of them came out, but a lot of them didn't. And I would hear stories too about when there were bootleggers up in Lake of the Woods, which actually lasted until after Prohibition, because Lake of the Woods was abutted Roseau County, which was a dry county. There were dry and wet counties in Minnesota, and so bootlegging continued apace, and there was a bar right on the county line, and I'm digressing, sorry. But anyway, bootleggers often were in the bog because they could escape detection, and the smell of the mash, you can read all about this in my first book, would mingle with muskeg smoke, and so it would be very tough to detect them. So bootleggers often hung out at or near the bog, and my mother said there were all kinds of stories about disappeared people who maybe were their enemies or something like that. So, as I said before, if they actually mined the bog in Minnesota, I'm sure they'd find all kinds of bodies up there. But largely the bog witches, and just this thing of being incredibly careful. Like, I don't know if this is answering your question. I'm digressing all over the place. But I remember when my mother was still alive and living up in Lake of the Woods, and I'd be driving up from the Twin Cities to visit her. I actually wrote an essay about this, about the bog, of course. But I would stop in Kellier, which was kind of the last outpost before I went into the big bog, which goes over Lake of the Woods, Beltrami, Couchiching, part of Roseau. I'm not even sure where else. But in any event, I'd say, "Okay, Mom, I'm going to the bog," and she'd say, "All right, honey." And so if I wasn't if I wasn't at the house, which was 20 miles outside of Baudette, within 2 hours max, then she'd call the state patrol, and they'd go out and look for me. And not that I would have ventured into the bog, I would have been nuts, but there are deer in really deep ditches, so it's definitely spooky when you're driving through it and there's like nothing, nothing except, watching for deer eyes and this muskeg smoke drifting across the road. So, yeah, a lot of mystery, for sure.
I was just going to add some of the things that I heard about bogs. My husband Patty, in the back row there, is from Offaly, the county in Ireland that has the most bogs. It's like 80% bogland. People always say to me, "You can tell he's from Offaly. He puts his feet down very carefully." So, I'd be writing books about the bog, and I had to, have him give me a lesson on how you cut turf, and he gave me diagrams and showed me exactly how you do it. So, he really helped me a lot in trying to set a story in the bogs. And then I was writing the second book, which is set industrial bogs, where they mine the peat. It's like strip mining, surface of the peat, which they have tried here in Minnesota too. I found an article about it from 2004.
Saw that.
And, you know, I'm trying to set the story there and trying to come up with details that not a lot of people would know about the bog or things that happened there. And he said, oh yeah, well sometimes there's a fairy wind. And I said, what? And he said, yeah, the wind, if it's dry, the wind picks up this loose peat. It's really light. So the wind picks up and there's a little tornado, there's a little whirlwind. And you can
have that in one of your books, I remember.
Yes,
Yeah.
and you can be blinded by it, and it gets in all the lights and the machinery. It's like a dust storm here, you know. So of course I had to put that in when he was telling me about it, and you have to wear, you know, you can breathe it in. It can really affect your lungs and all kinds of stuff. So, and the other thing that people talk about is the will-o'-the-wisp, is what he calls it. And sometimes the wind is considered will-o'-the-wisp, and sometimes it's lights in the bog, and it's, you know, some kind of methane gas or something that's
That's what
burning.
they say.
And they do, I mean, the bogs in Ireland do spontaneously combust, like the Muskeg, but it's so wet there that it's, I mean, it's super, super wet. It's rainforest climate, really. So it's hard to keep those fires going.
Bet it is. This is funny. It's like we're reading each other's mind. Because my first question for Erin was, given the extensive mining of Ireland's peat, oh, well, actually, I guess it's a little bit different.
Yeah.
How do you think the myth and folklore surrounding the bogs has survived? Because definitely it's survived based on what you've just said and then based on your books.
Right. But the mining, the turf extraction, they call it, and it's stopped now.
Good.
I mean, industrial scale has stopped now. That only works on really huge tracts of bogland where they can bring big machines and things like that. But there are tons and tons and tons of smaller bogs where it doesn't make sense to extract industrially. So people still cut those by hand, or they use smaller machines to extrude the turf, and still about 30% of people in Ireland burn turf for fuel.
Wow.
Even people who live in the city go up to the grandparents' place in Mayo and bring back the turf that they need for the whole year in the spring.
Do they like the smell of it? Is it just part
free.
of their, it's free, of course, yes. So
That
romantic,
is the
yeah.
big controversy, is that, you know, they've had this free source of fuel for hundreds of years, and now they're being asked to, you know, pay.
So despite the fact that the bogs have been mined so thoroughly, what percentage of the bogs do you think are gone in Ireland?
98%.
Oh. So how have the myth and the folklore survived, even with all that?
Because there are people like Patty, and he grew up working on the industrial bog. I had him take me back to the workshop where he worked, and I said, will anyone remember you? He said, it was 1969. And we walked up to the door, and a guy came out and looked us up and down and said, O'Brien, what do you want? And everybody who worked there in 1969 was still there, because it's like mining and logging and all of those industries. It's the good job. And if you live in that place, that's what you do. But they, you know, all the surrounding bogs, the smaller bogs, still have all of this mystery and folklore about them, and they're dangerous places to go, and so that gets passed down. I mean, there's still plenty of small bogland around. It's just the big industrial bogs are gone.
You had something in one of your books too. I'm a big fan of Erin, and I reread all four of the books for this. It was a pleasure. It was so much fun. But there was something in one of your books, I think, about a special ritual that was done in the moon, in the bog, the full moon. Am I mixing up with?
Yeah,
What?
I think that was in Lake of Sorrows. And
Okay, never
it's,
mind.
you know, sort of ceremony of protection.
Yes,
There are
yes,
lots
yes,
of
yes,
those.
but not the
And-
bog.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
It's near the bog.
Okay.
Yeah, it happens at certain times of the year.
Yes.
I think midsummer was that one
Yeah.
that I was
These
talking
two
about there.
lovers.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, there's all
Yeah.
kinds of stuff like that. There are always fires at midsummer, at the spring equinox, the fall equinox, Halloween, you know, all of those things. All of that stuff. I mean, even though Ireland is a modern country and a Catholic country, there's all of this old stuff that's just I mean, the rest is a veneer over the old stuff. It's all still there.
I love that. I think Ireland is really lucky. I saw some vestiges of it when I was in England, but nothing like Ireland,
Mhm.
for sure. Yeah.
Let's see. I wondered as I was reading Muskeg, and the first book too, Hand Me Down My Walking Cane, takes place in the 30s. They're a few years apart, and I wondered what drew you to that period in particular.
Okay, well, some of you already know this story, but not all of you. So I've always been really intrigued by the 30s. From the time I was a little girl, and as many writers, I grew up listening to stories and being absolutely fascinated by stories. So I would beg the adults around me to tell me stories. They said, "Oh, you don't want to hear this old story." I said, "Oh, yes, I do want to hear it." And
Budding folklorist in you.
probably, yeah.
Oral history.
And plus we didn't have television. This is the pre-digital age, right? So I mean, we were very primitive, and we had the radio and this big console. We played checkers and we played hockey and listened to stories, and swam in the summer. But so I would hear my mother particularly, because my dad, I think his experiences were more bitter than my mom's. Among other things, he had bad PTSD from World War II. But so she would talk more. She was a storyteller too. And she'd tell me about the Depression and how hard it was, and how she was on a farm. Almost everybody up there was on a farm back then, unless you had a business in town. And how sometimes there was nothing to eat in the house but blueberries, which you always had, and oatmeal. And sometimes, if they were lucky, their mother would make milk mush with blueberries. And my mom would always say, to this day, I can't eat blueberries. And the other interesting thing, and I'll get into some of the other reasons for the 30s, is that the other reason she always had, as most people did back then, she'd make Folgers coffee for us. And I remember when, good coffee finally came to this country, and so I brought some good coffee up to Lake of the Woods to make for my mom and said, "Mom, this is wonderful." And she said, "Oh, honey, it reminds me of the Depression," because during the Depression, they would sell coffee beans in the store, and they would grind them for you. And, to me, this sounds like nirvana, right? But to my mother, it just would bring her back to the 30s and, real poverty. Yeah. But I think the other things about the 30s that really interested me, so a couple things. First of all, the lawlessness. I ended up practicing criminal law for a long time. I think there's a reason, right? I was really pretty intrigued by crime. And so there were these bootleggers, and it was a time of political turmoil, and there were strikes, and there were a lot of lefties, and today's DFLer would have been the Communist Party back then, because that was what you did if you were a leftist, right? And so it was incredibly interesting. It was interesting also artistically. You had the WPA writers projects and painting projects. Actually, just a little anecdote, right here in town, the brand new Uncle Hugo and Uncle Edgar's bookstore, which is over near the once burned down post office, so it was burned down. Yeah, they just opened up. It's wonderful. You have to see it. It's on 31st Street, but going toward the river. They were lucky enough to snag this building that has this big, beautiful painting of Minnehaha Falls painted onto the plaster. And they got it that way. And one of the reasons that the owner sold it to them was that the guy that wanted to buy the place was going to tear it down, including the painting, and he just could not tolerate that. So Uncle Hugo and Uncle Edgar, the owners, said, "Please let us have the painting," and they protected it so you can see it. But anyway, and I am digressing, I apologize. But there was a WPA theater, all that stuff. And also, and this was a later interest of mine, the Spanish Civil War, which I became aware of living in Mexico City in the 70s. And right before Franco was going to die, and Franco had just ordered the garroting of 4 Basque separatists, and there were huge demonstrations in the streets of Mexico City. And I met for the first time these Spanish war refugees, who were some of the most interesting people I'd ever met in my life. And I was in my 20s, really impressionable age. And I met one woman in particular who had been a journalist and had just come out with a book, and we became good friends. And again, she told me the stories, and I became passionate about the Spanish Civil War. Actually, it's going to play a really strong part in my third book. And with all things in that period, Mexico maintained diplomatic relations with the Spanish Republic in exile, and actually had like an embassy. There was a little embassy. They had a car with diplomatic plates. Anyway, I could go on, but I will really go way over the top if I do. So, yeah. So that's what drew me to that period. Oh, was there time?
Oh, he's giving a signal.
15 minutes.
What?
15 minutes.
You're kidding. Oh my God. Okay. Sorry. Okay, then I gotta talk to you again. All right. Let's talk about memory. Because you told me that bogs to you mean memory. And you were talking about the Seamus Heaney poem, about the archaeology, about finding actual preserved bodies. And I'm going to read a quote from Honda Grant, which I thought was incredibly cool. I forget who says it. There is no history but local history, and some of that is written down, and some of it lost, and a good bit of it is carried in what you might call the collective memory of ordinary people, whether they realize it or not. That's a great quote. Talk about memory, please.
That's what the Heaney poem says to me. He says, they've taken the skeleton of the great Irish elk out of the peat, set it up an astounding crate full of air. And there are all of these artifacts that are found, that are preserved in the bog. And I think, to me, it's the subconscious, it's the brain, which never forgets anything, you know? And you can rediscover those things if you start digging. Another thing that just strikes me about memory, Patty and I were driving along the road, and we saw this little tree, and it was covered with ribbons and eyeglasses and baby shoes and napkins and handkerchiefs and all kinds of things. And I said, stop the car, I have to see what that is. And we got out and we walked all around it. And he said, oh yeah, when I was a kid, my father used to decorate a bush like this in front of the house on the 1st of May. And I said, why? Why did he do it? He said, I have no idea. So the memory was there, but then I had to go home and do research and find out that on the 1st of May is the time when the fairies are most powerful. And the whole month of May, they're kind of dangerous. So you have to protect your house against them. And you put all these little baubles, and I forget what he said, little ribbons and little strings of flowers and tinsel paper from like gum wrappers and things like that to sort of scare them off or distract them from what was going on in the house. So there are lots and lots of things like that. The people in Ireland remember, oh, this is what this is why we do this. And it turned out that that tree that we stopped at was next to a holy well. And that was why it was there. These were offerings for intercessions to the gods for people. And they still have what they call pattern days around every holy well in Ireland. And it's whatever saint it's named after, it's that saint's day that people go and they walk in circles around the well a certain number of times because that's magic.
Oh, I love that.
And they just keep doing things even though they don't really understand why. I love that.
I do too. I really love that. Are we at question time for the audience?
Yes.
We certainly can be.
I would. Was that where you're giving us a 10-minute warning? Or no?
We're at 12 minutes.
Okay.
12 minutes left, you mean?
Yes.
Whoa.
7:48.
That was fast. Jeez. Well, we got through most of our things.
Yeah.
Well,
We can give our paper to somebody and have them.
absolutely, yeah. So, that's my husband with his hand up. You're a shill. I don't know if you should answer.
And then stand up. One of the things that Carla and I do is argue about our characters.
Yes.
You know, and do you and your husband
Argue about characters? No, he doesn't read the books until they're published, so
Oh, okay.
he doesn't like loose pages.
Yeah, so you don't argue about characters.
No, I mean, I have a writers group and we argue about the characters. My mom argues with me about them, so.
Okay.
Maybe I should stop doing that, actually. More domestic peace. So, questions? Hey Stevie,
Hello.
it's my swimming buddy. It's my floor.
So the bog, now that you've written about it and thought about it, what is each of your personal relationship with the bog?
I can go first. I mean, my personal relationship is just deepened. I mean, I'm more intrigued than ever, and I want to explore the bog more, and maybe take somebody with me. Like, there's a guy who works in the woods at in Lake of the Woods who's smart and can fly a plane, and I'd love to go for a plane ride above the bog, but also just go in more, and very, very carefully, of course, because it really is pretty dangerous. Yeah, I think I was always grateful to grow up where I grew up because it's very beautiful and real unusual, but I'm really grateful now. I just think it was such a unique, amazing place to grow up.
So Patty grew up at the edge of a bog. His family used turf to heat their home. I mean, they had a cook stove in the kitchen, and it was connected to the hot water for the house, the radiators. It did everything. They cooked on that cook stove, so they had a lot of boiled dinners, not a lot of roasted things, because it wouldn't ever get really hot enough. I once tried roasting a chicken, and Patty's father had to boil himself a couple of eggs because it was taking so long with the chicken. He was starving. So that was a failure. But I understand why people are still attached to using turf, but I also understand the environmental impact of what they're doing, and so I'm a preservationist. And then again, we wouldn't have found all of the really interesting things that have been found in bogs if they weren't extracting it. So it's always like the knife's edge,
You brought some of those things, didn't you?
Yes.
Yeah. You should pass them around to me if you feel safe doing it. It's over on your left.
This is turf from Ireland. You feel how heavy it is. So the big piece on top would come out of the bog about the size of a shoebox. And it would shrink down because it's 90% water. And the wood is pine, the lighter brown one, and the black one is oak. And
Fused together.
Those have been in the bog for thousands of years. And that turf is probably a few thousand years old as well, because it's nice and black.
So it's really hard.
Yes. And you can't start it like just with a match. You need to put some kerosene or diesel fuel or something on it. I once rented a house from a guy who left us turf to burn in the fireplace, and he left us turf and a bottle of diesel fuel. And we started the fire, built the fire, and then realized we had no matches. So I said to my aunt who was traveling with me, "That's all right, I'll just stick a newspaper in the toaster and we'll start it that way." She said, "You will not." So then the guy came back a few days later, and I said, "Brian, thanks so much for the turf and the diesel, and we just don't have any matches." "Oh, Jesus," he said, and he rolls up newspaper and sticks it in the toaster. He says, "You live in the country, you can't be going to town for everything." So, I mean, I love the smell of it. It can really get to your lungs. My father-in-law had emphysema, and the turf smoke in the house was probably not good for. He also worked in a factory where there was a lot of turf dust, and that may have contributed to his problems. But so it's the nostalgia factor is great, and yet it's the best carbon sink in the world.
Yes.
So
I was going to talk about that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Better
It
than
absorbs
trees.
carbon. It's
Yeah.
really amazing. Yeah. Hey Tim.
There's one thing about the relationship, similar to what we discussed already, but the relationship to the land as a source of inspiration. How would you characterize that in your own creative process?
I can talk about that. I know for me it's just kind of natural. I mean, Pam went to MFA school and knows this about me, but I'm just kind of, I don't know. I felt like I couldn't have said so when I was growing up, but I realized now I was just kind of saturated with place, and I loved it, right? And I felt like it kind of made my childhood. And so when I'm writing things, I find myself getting these long descriptions of place to the point where I have to say, okay, stop, put in some dialogue, do a scene. But yeah, it's just kind of in me. I think it's nature and nurture, if you will. But yeah, it's very much a part of me. And no matter, I said this at my lunch, but I tried writing a couple of suspense novels before I came out with the second one, and I just kind of left them alone because I mean, I may go back to them, but I always go back to Lake Woods County and the forest and the water and the bogs. So I don't know, it's got a big pull.
No
And
pun intended.
my
What's
relation-
that?
No pun intended.
Nope. No, right.
And I always think of in ancient Ireland how they described the land as a female body. There are mountains that are called the Paps of Anu, the breasts of Anu. And so the land was a goddess, the highest goddess of them all. All the rivers were goddesses as well. Everything was goddess, you know. So that was their relationship with the land in ancient Ireland. And I think that's all still there. You can see those places still. And the Paps of Anu were probably ancient burial mounds where there were cairns on top of a mountain. Every mountain in Ireland has a rock pile on it that is a tomb.
Sounds like Mexico.
Yeah.
The pyramids. There's
Right.
almost every hill is a pyramid underneath it in southern Mexico.
Really wild, yeah, like that. So it's personal. 5 minutes.
5 more minutes.
Yeah.
Okay. Get your questions out now. Monica.
I just would like to hear from each of you, like, how do you view your creativity? Like, Erin, you were talking about how the story of the girl, just that spark kind of hit you. Was the whole story there, or did it unfold over time? Are there things that you do to nurture your creativity? Where do your stories come from?
You go.
Okay.
Yeah.
It was not all there. I just had like a couple of paragraphs to begin with. Actually, I got a letter from an agent who said, send me more of your fiction work after I won a short story contest. And I said, I don't have any more fiction work, but I have a novel idea about a red-haired girl whose head is found in a bog. She said, send me 50 pages. Like, okay, now I gotta write 50 pages. So that was, you know, the boot up the arse that got me going. But I find that it's, I have to like mine my subconscious. I go to sleep thinking of, you know, what is my current problem? What do I need to happen or to figure out? And in that sleeping, waking time between, like when you first wake up and you're not really conscious, the subconscious can flow. And that's where I find the answers to things. So that was a thing that I often have done when working on a story, is trying to find the answers in, you know, things emerge out of the subconscious. That's where all story is. And also I feel like I'm discovering what comes next in the story, like my characters are digging and uncovering things, and they uncover connections, and that's what drives the story, is connections.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I do that too, and I'm in the thick of writing a novel. I'll go to sleep and try to figure out a certain issue that needs to be resolved and hope I dream about it, and then wake up in the morning and write as fast as I can. And I think, you know, although my characters are not archaeologists, but I'm in a writing group with Monica, but we've talked about the writer who's an architect and knows exactly where they're going. And actually, I'm surprised you said that, because you, as a mystery writer, kind of have to know where you're going.
No,
So, okay, she's...
I get lost in the bog a lot.
That makes me feel better, because I'm not an architect. So the other thing they say is a gardener. You know, you plant things, you see how it's going to be.
Right.
I often don't know how my books are going to end. This Muskeg, I wasn't sure how it was going to end until...
Ooh, it's a
Those-
corker.
Yeah, that's right. So, I don't know, I do that. I do a lot of reading too. Some people can't read when they're doing, but I read all kinds of things from the 30s, in the 30s. I don't know, from bootleggers, from, you know, everything I
And
can.
you get the language
I
and
get
the
the
music and
language,
stuff
yeah,
just right. It's
exactly,
great.
yeah, yeah. Anything else? Is that it? Matthew's gonna give me the high sign here.
I wonder, are there characters that come up that you like, that you really kind of go, oh, this is, you're just intrigued and fascinated by that particular character? It's sort of like a mother who has a child that they really bond with, and another is like, oh dear. I mean, that's true, right?
Some that are just pains in the ass.
You go ahead. You go first.
When I was writing Haunted Ground, I didn't know that you shouldn't have amateur detectives and a police detective in the same story. It's usually a police procedural or the other, and so I had them both, and it's like, okay, how do I do that? And my character, Garrett Devaney, is a policeman, and he plays the fiddle, and he's sort of estranged from his wife, not getting along, and his older kids think he's useless. And it's only his youngest daughter, and he's trying to teach her how to play the fiddle. And that became really important to me in the story. And my editor was reading, or no, it was my agent, was reading the novel when I sent her one of many, many drafts. And she said, this detective guy, he doesn't even solve the mystery, get rid of him. And I'm like, no! Can't do that! So I made him, come up with some more clues so that he could be involved in that. And then I had to bring him back in the third book because I had to see how his daughter was getting on with the fiddle.
I loved his character, just to tell you. And I definitely have favorite characters too, like Sadie, who was a character in my first book. I almost did away with her in that first book, but I could not bear to do it. I just, I really, really love her. She's like this rough character and plain spoken. Reminds me of one of my aunts, who Lyra knows who it is, but not that she was a madam, but she just, she, as they say in Spanish, she had no hairs on her tongue. I mean, things would just come out. But that's why she crops up again this book. I just couldn't do it without her. She's always there.
And you get to know stuff about her even in
Yes,
the second book.
you do.
And a lot more detail. And my sister is also a writer, and she said the reason that she reads books is to get inside other people's heads. And you do that so beautifully.
So do you. Well, we should stop, right, Matthew?
Sure.
Well, I think that you're...
Is there any other questions before we adjourn for the evening?
I do have one.
Bruce.
Having lived in Minnesota my whole life, how, and the concept of bogs are so fascinating, but is it because I've grown up in the Twin Cities and have lived here
There are
rather
bogs
than
here.
up in... What?
There are bogs here.
Hopkins
Oh,
is over.
really?
Eloise Butler Wildflower Garden has a bog.
There's a teeny tiny
so
bog
how
out there.
how do I not know about them?
Well, 'cause
Why
it's-
is this so new
It's
and
about a mile
fascinating?
square, but Bruce, it really is like at least 2 or maybe 3 Minnesotas. I mean, you've got the prairie, right, and you've got the urban area, and then you have up north, right, particularly where I'm from, which is not even like the boundary wires. It's not like hip or cool. It's just wild, It's so I think it really does have to do with how you grow up. Yeah, I mean, no wonder you don't know.
Yeah, that's
Um,
fascinating.
I met people I think in the Twin Cities, when I would do readings and talk about the bogs, who said they cut turf to burn for fuel during the Depression because they had to buy firewood and they couldn't afford it. So,
Wow.
Hopkins was all bog.
yeah.
Just straight out, flat, nothing, everything.
What is?
Hopkins was solid cranberry bogs.
Yeah.
Yes,
And
yes,
so wide.
yes. I think there's a slide of Erin had put together this great PowerPoint. She's got a cranberry bog in there.
Yeah. Well, that's the peat mining in Minnesota, that picture.
I know. I hope it never gets to be a big thing. Yeah, anyway, keep reading my books. Bruce is my neighbor. We're in a condo. We kind of run the condo together. We're like, got 6 units. It's, I don't know, it's like, I call the other people the communards because it's kind of like, anyway.
Well, we should thank you all for coming
Yes,
tonight.
thank you
Oh,
so
thank
much.
you.
Everybody.